another good crowd this month. This is great. Like I mentioned last month and the month before, this is in January, we'll be starting our 8th year. That's with me hosting the event. But before that, it's been around for 5 or 6 years before. So just wanted to let you know. Today, our speaker is Mr. Warren Perrin, attorney from ERAD, and today he's going to be talking about NAP, the New Acadia Project. Please give Warren a warm welcome.
Merci William. Bienvenue à tous et tous. Je m'appelle Warren Perrin et j'étais né dans un petit village de Henry, dans la Prairie Grecque. I'm from Henry, in a little area called Prairie Grecque, south of Iraq. And I still have a farm there, and I'm still very involved in Vermilion Parish, where we have the Acadian Museum, which is without a doubt the largest Acadian museum in the United States. We have over 5,000 artifacts. And the man standing in the back filming is Kermit Bouillon. He's been on the board of directors, executive committee, since the beginning in 1990. And we've created, using over 300 recordings, mostly done by Kermit over the years, we've created an Acadian Museum YouTube channel where you can see interviews we did with people sometimes 40 and 50 years ago. And we got the support of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, and they gave us enough money to hire the University of Louisiana professors to digitize them for us. So a lot of this is in French, some in English, some both. So I invite you all to check that out. We started considering locating the first Acadian settlement in the mid-90s. We had several meetings at that time with the mayor, who was Charlie Longlinay, who just died recently. And it never really got off the ground. I think it was a little early. We hadn't yet had the first Congrès Mondial Acadien, or World Acadian Reunion in Louisiana. The first time we hosted it was in '99. That created a lot of interest. It also caused many of the families to unite and organize in anticipation of the Congrès. And so we formed something called CAFA, which was an umbrella organization of all the Acadian families in Louisiana. At one time, I think we had something like 50 organized families. And so the Broussard family naturally took the lead in trying to develop the New Acadia Project, because we were trying to find the burial site of the leader of the first group of Acadians to come to Louisiana, Joseph Beausoleil Broussard. And I can't say that we have located the actual site of the burials, and we may never be able to do that because they were being buried rapidly under an epidemic of peacock smallpox. So we know that there were 39 burial sites. I'll show you where we believe they are, but of course they were not buried in iron caskets. They were struggling to survive. They had only arrived on the Bayou Teche there for about 3 months when they got hit with this epidemic. So they were in basically survival mode. But as you'll see in the end, we have, with the help of Dr. Mark Reese, head of the Archaeology and Anthropology Department at UL, put up a historical marker designating where we believe the first Acadian settlement was situated, and it's right near the town of Loreauville. We've identified at least 30 possible home sites in that area by reclaiming, identifying, sorting thousands of shards of pottery which date to the correct time period. So, without further ado, most of you are very familiar. There are some in this room that probably know more about Acadian history than me, like Miss Gail Blow-Smith, who never fails to attend my talks. And so I'm going to do a quick run-through on Acadian history. Many of these images you will see come from the Center for Louisiana Studies or Dr. Shane Bernard's book, which he graciously allows us to use. For the 250th anniversary of the arrival, we had a commemoration in New Orleans. And my son Andy, who was an architect and an artist, designed this poster to show Beausoleil walking on the wooden steps on the dock at New Orleans. He found a small print in the archives, and he used that to depict the ship in the harbor. And it is reported by the acting governor, who didn't know these Acadians were coming, by the way. They just showed up. The first thing they did was knelt in prayer, as you see the three women. And the second thing they did was they danced on the dock. And you see them dancing. And then they walked to the little church in the background, which today, the St. Louis Cathedral is at that location. But we know that because they consecrated marriages and baptized babies. That's documented. And so we put on a live performance at the Jean Lafitte National Park. It was very successful. And so now we'll go into the brief history. I'd like you to set aside for a moment what you know about the deportation and think about the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims. The great-grandchildren of the Pilgrims deported the great-grandchildren of the first Acadians. In 1604, two things happened. The Acadians left from that region of France, you see to the west, central west. 1604, the Pilgrims were exiled from England because of their puritanical religious beliefs, which the Anglican Church saw as a grave threat. So the Acadians, of course, settled at first the Port Royal, which you see there indicated at the habitation. And they immediately befriended and took in and welcomed the Mi'kmaq people. And that relationship cannot be overestimated on the impact of the development of the Acadian culture and what we are today. In 1620, the Pilgrims were forced out of Europe, and they got on the Mayflower and they went to transport their cuckoo bird religion that nobody believed in except themselves. And they were led by Edward Winslow. He wrote the Pilgrims' Compact and was acknowledged to be their leader. Never elected, but just the leader. The man who deported the Acadians, who was also from Boston, was the great-grandson of Edward Winslow. His name was Colonel John Winslow. And he was not a military man, but he was designated because he had such high respect in the New England area that he called on the men to join the militia. And he has an ad in several newspapers. So what I'm telling you is not made up. It's in the Philadelphia Gazette and many other newspapers in Boston. And when you read it, it's like reading Nazi propaganda by Goebbels. It's ethnic cleansing, it's ethnic hatred that the Pilgrims had against the Catholic Acadians. So you couldn't find people more different living next to each other, literally. Because when you look at Acadia here, we're including Maine. And Maine, of course, is bumping up against Massachusetts. And so, after 1620, the Acadians prospered. Of course, the Apuato, the use of that drainage system allowed them to drain the marshes, which you see situated here around the first settlement, the habitation. That was not an accident, because many of these Acadians had come from the Loire Valley, and they had been for many, many decades involved in the harvesting of sea salt. And so they knew how to control tides, and they knew that system. And so when they got to Nova Scotia and they realized the highest tides in the world were there, averaging 38 feet, the highest being 84-foot tides at the mouth of the Petitcodiac River, highest in the world. The Micmac showed them their hunting grounds. And they asked the Acadians not to disturb the hunting grounds. And they said, y'all want to be farmers and fishermen, we'll show you. And they, with the aid of the Micmac, they developed this aboiteau system, using everybody together to work on one farm while the tide was out. So that bonded the community. That made third cousins feel like they were first cousins. So they worked together, and the Acadians never disturbed the Micmac hunting grounds, helping to firm up their friendship. When this is going on in the 1680s, you know what happens in the Pilgrims? Salem witch trials. They start burning the teenage girls at the stake because they believe the devil has taken control of their soul. So, you know, Pilgrims and Thanksgiving is basically a big myth. They were slaughtering the Indians while the Acadians were literally intermarrying with many of the Micmac. And in fact, the big chief, Mermentun, actually converted to Catholicism voluntarily. So here we depict that friendship between the Micmac and the Acadians. And of course, we know that Lieutenant Governor Charles Lawrence was really the mind behind, the brains behind the deportation. But he didn't have the military to carry it out, which is why he had to turn to Winslow to get 800 militia to march to the north and rid forever the papists who threaten us from the north. It's like Game of Thrones, you know. The evil from the north are going to come down and eat our children and steal our women. I mean, that's the prejudice that they engendered to get this massive support and trick the Acadians. No one liked Charles Lawrence. I mean, people under him and above him had no great respect for Charles Lawrence. And the only reason he became acting governor, the actual governor, was Hobson. He got very sick and he had to return to England. Had that not happened, there probably would have been no deportation. But Lawrence was manipulated by the leaders in Boston. That's your takeaway today. It didn't come from good old London, England. No. It was never ordered that we can prove it came from the British home government. It came from Boston. How do we know this? They ended up with all the lands. You didn't have British come in there and settle. They all moved up from New England and settled on the Acadians' farmlands. Always follow the money in history, and you can pretty much figure out why things happen. So, some call it genocide now. We used to just call it ethnic cleansing, but when you lose 1/3 of your population, that's genocide. That's what we call the Holocaust. For the Jewish people, there were 18 million before World War II, and 6 million were killed. And we call that their Holocaust. Well, this is our Acadian deportation. It wasn't a grand dérangement. That was an English way to make it seem like it wasn't a big deal to those who don't speak French. Dérangement means a little bothersome. It was a little more than bothersome. Now, we could spend all day talking about the diaspora, but suffice it to say, as a general rule, 1/3 were deported to the British colonies, 1/3 escaped, and 1/3 perished. Those who escaped are those we're going to talk about today, because they are the ones that came to settle the territory known today as Acadia, which was then called the Attacable Territory. And I read a book recently. It was quite interesting. I had never thought the governors in the British colonies were never forewarned that the Acadians were coming. They just had to, the ship showed up and the order went out, you shall feed, clothe, and shelter these people. And they viewed themselves as enemies of the Acadians. And yet, they had to follow the orders, and so they put them up in sheds and barns and lean-tos, and they had to basically use a lot of their children as indentured servants. We know that Beausoleil and the group that lived around the Beaubassin and the Petitcodiac River considered themselves living on French territory. And yet the British still went after them, captured them, and put them in Fort Beauséjour. But the men were able to dig a tunnel one night and escape. We can't prove this, but it's said that the women had to feed their husbands and their sons in prison. And they would bake utensils in the bread, and they would use those utensils to dig the tunnels. So, successfully, they joined with their friends, the Micmac, and they led a very successful insurgency, guerrilla campaign against the British. And ultimately, when Quebec fell in 1759, the war was essentially over, so Beausoleil negotiated a surrender, and they were marched to Halifax and put on George's Island in a prison camp. About 800 of them, and probably half died. Beausoleil lost his wife Agnes there, but his granddaughter Elizabeth Broussard was born in the prison camp. Now, we're not talking about buildings. They had to build their own shelters. But the younger Acadian men were allowed to leave and go work and literally go restore their own farms where their dike system had been destroyed by a hurricane. So that's how they survived, by letting the young go work for the British, and they'd return. So they stayed there for about nearly 4 years. Let me go back one second. So when the war was over, the Treaty of Paris signed in 1763, we don't know how Beausoleil was able to obtain a ship. Some speculate the British furnished the boat because they wanted Beausoleil out of there. They figured he would sneak if he were allowed to remain and cut the throats of a lot of the leaders as they slept. That's the kind of reputation he had. He was known to the British as the ultimate terrorist because they engaged in savage fighting. They scalped the British. They shot the British in the back. They shot them while they slept. They were fighting with pitchforks and rifles, and the British had cannons and ships. So you do what you have to do. One man's hero is another's terrorist. So somehow he managed to get a ship, and 202 people got aboard. The Tromons, the Guilbeaults, the Leblancs, many Broussards, and they set sail for what they thought that would be the French West Indies. But when they got there, it was horrible conditions, and so they just managed to regroup and get on another boat and come to New Orleans. The journey took about 7 months, the whole journey from Halifax to New Orleans. But when they got to New Orleans, they thought they were going to be in a French territory, but secretly Louisiana had been transferred to Spain. But remarkably, Spain took them in, and that's why on our Acadian flag, on the lower right-hand corner, we have the gold castle of Spain. Now, there were some Acadians sent back to France, which begs the question, why? Why were some sent to the British colonies and some sent to France? The answer is, there were some portions around Acadia which had remained French, namely Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island. So those Acadians were French citizens and could not be sent to the British colonies. They had to be sent back to France in repatriation. Those Acadians sent to the British colonies had elected to remain in Nova Scotia and had been granted the status of British subjects. But good Queen Anne, in an effort to keep them in Nova Scotia, and not allow them to leave. They had 1 year, do I go or do I stay? And most of them decided to stay on their lands, which they had been there for 150 years. Why would you abandon your lands? And she gave them the one exception where a British subject could practice the Catholic faith. So they stayed and allowed them to practice. So good Queen Anne was named that because she did a lot of good things. Now the King of Spain started negotiating with the King of France as to what to do with the 4,000 Acadians ending up in France. So they didn't want to work. They wanted to go back to join their families in North America. And most of the word getting back to them was, allons à Lafayette, allons à la Louisiana. Because that's where they were best treated by the Spanish, with their Spanish land grants. So all of these Acadians in France were clamoring for 30 years, let us go, let us go, let us go. And they wouldn't let them leave. They wanted them to start working. They needed manpower. And these were skilled workers, but they wouldn't work. Two things happened for the first time. Welfare was created by the king, and he put those Acadians on welfare. Before that, it was only the church that would do alms. But you see, he was trying to cajole them into staying, and they wouldn't do it. Why? Here's your second big takeaway from my talk today. They had developed a new ethnicity. They were no longer French. They were no longer British subjects. Nous sommes des Acadiens, a new way of viewing life. And they wouldn't go back to the old ways. They had tasted freedom. They had learned from the Mi'kmaq. Inalienable rights coming from the Creator, not from a government. That got them in trouble. But they were starting to think about revolution. They never said it, but by not taking the oath, it was a de facto way of revolting. And the British couldn't take that. So that's why one of the ways they were treated so cruelly. So there's so many first and interesting things that were happening on the world stage that the Acadians were the heart of this. And so, ultimately, a bargain was made between the King of Spain and the King of France, where the welfare money that had been spent partially was reimbursed by Spain on the condition they were allowed to go to Louisiana. And that's why in 1785, they allowed the 7 ships to come to Louisiana. And many people were lying and saying they were Acadians, and they weren't, to get on those boats and come to Louisiana. So that was the largest group that came. Before that, we only had about 800 Acadians that were in Louisiana. There weren't that many. So ultimately, you're talking somewhere a little over 3,000 came to settle. And the reason they settled in Tacapon was because there was a shortage of meat. All of the cattle provided to New Orleans had come from the east, Mississippi, Alabama, and that was given to Britain. Florida parish went all the way to the Mississippi, so they couldn't buy meat from the British. So they had to create new sources, and that's the deal that was struck in the Dauterive Cattle Compact, where they said, if you do sharecropping of cattle, we'll give you all the lands, all the provisions, everything you need was provided to them by the Spanish government, which is remarkable. You know, one of the books back there on the table that we have for sale, we wrote about the first time Acadians went back to Nova Scotia since the deportation. That was led by Dudley J. LeBlanc, who was in 1930. As far as we know, no Acadian from Louisiana had ever gone back. And that was for the 175th anniversary at Grand Prix. And the Louisiana girls kept diaries, and our book is based upon Corinne Broussard's diary, a girl from Beaubridge. She died at 104, and her family gave us not only her diary, but her entire scrapbook, which is full of wonderful information. And she kept writing in her diary, I don't understand why the Acadians here in Canada are so poor. You see, those who tried to go back were mistreated for a century. We didn't have that in Louisiana. That's why they all wanted to come here. They couldn't go to school for 50, 75 years because they were illegal immigrants. They were not supposed to have returned. But they returned anyway. They settled in 8 or 9 spots around Nova Scotia. And we're going to have the next World Acadian reunion in one of those areas on the French shore around Church Point in 2024. So it's just an interesting account of how they were treated so well in Louisiana. And once they were able to gain their strength, took them 4 months, the government provided free housing for them in a warehouse in Algiers Point. They named Beausoleil Captain Commandant of the province, and they headed toward the Bayou Teche. And they were accompanied by a Colonel Andre, who was supposed to make a map and bring them to the best lands that they were aware of. If he made a map, it's been lost to history. He either didn't make it or it got lost, which is why we don't know exactly where they settled. So when they arrived, they probably used the methods that the Native Americans would use, palmetto. I have this to make sure I mention the cattle importance. You can't, again, overestimate how cattle got them on their feet in one generation. Because Beausoleil's 2 sons died wealthy men. Within one generation, they died wealthy with slaves, many slaves. Amon was one of the wealthiest men in the area, and his succession, his estate is in the courthouse in St. Martinville. Amazing how much land he had. But my wife and I were invited to do this talk at the University of Texas at Austin. When I got to this slide, I paused to all my Texas friends and cousins, and I said, 100 years before there were cowboys in Texas, the Acadians were the cowboys bringing cattle from the Attakapaw to New Orleans through the swamps. And they were all kind of, I said, yeah, Chisholm Trail and cowboys didn't get started till after the Civil War. Here we're talking 1770s. So we have a proud and a long heritage that we need to really make sure ancestors coming after us, descendants, know it. And I had the honor of serving as president of Cotefield from 1993 to 2010 under 5 governors. And here you have Jimmy DiMaggio, the founder, and Judge Babineau on the right, unfurling the Acadian flag designed by the professor, can't think of his name now, Arsenault. And you see the Spanish castle on the lower right. That, ladies and gentlemen, we are the only group of Acadians in the world that have our own flag. Now there's a world Acadian flag, which is much simpler than this. Ours is based on that. But other places, there's the other book we wrote. I'm going to plug the book because that's how we support our Acadian Museum in ERAF, keeping it free. We sell books. We've published 12 books. And it's the only area. Acadiana was designated as such in 1971, 22 parish area. You could never do that today. Can you imagine trying to designate a subsection of the state? They did it because they saw the value of the culture, because they saw how close they came to losing it, because they had outlawed speaking of French in public schools and public grounds, public buildings for 70 years. So they were trying to make up for this era. And in 1974, that flag was adopted as the Acadian flag. And, you know, most people recognize it more than the Louisiana flag. So this photograph, Darrell Bourke was a poet laureate for the state, and he wrote some beautiful works on Acadian poetry. My wife Mary's in the middle, and Anique Falk was a French immersion teacher. We were going to the Broussard family reunion at Vermilionville, and I just snapped this picture because this is where NAP got started. And we honored Charles and William Broussard, the 2 brothers from Cow Island. There's a difference between. John Broussard, who hosts the radio show on KRVS every Saturday morning, Les Articles sont pas salés, the famous song. He remarked how we need to do something to find that settlement. And we had Dr. Mark Reese as our speaker. And we promised him we'd raise $2,000 to help him. We ended up raising $375,000. And we gave every penny to the university. And we did this from 2013 until this year. And we're starting a new campaign as of this year. The first thing we had to do is get public support. You can't ask people to go dig in their backyard unless you have their understanding and support. And we knew there were many people that claimed to have Acadian graves in their backyards along the Bayou Teche. So we went to the Loreauville town meeting, and Al Broussard, the mayor, joined our effort and was instrumental in getting the town of Loreauville to accept us in their backyards. Dr. Shane Bernard addressed the meeting, spoke about the history part of it, and we began collecting urban legends from everybody that would want to tell us a story. And so we've documented thousands of stories of people saying, I know there's some burials in this site. So here, you find oftentimes 4 oak trees, and the space in the middle they were told never to dig, that it was an ancient graveyard. Again, this is the Robert Dafford mural at the Acadian Memorial. We got the Acadian Memorial support. We got the support of La Famille Beausoleil Broussard, the Broussard family. And we had to do public relations for the first year to make people understand what we were trying to accomplish. Not just dig up bones, but preserve the history. And here we see another possible burial site. This is where we have not yet done digging, but Dr. Mark Reese just told me recently, he believes this is probably the most likely burial site for the 39 Acadians buried in that short period of maybe 2 months when they were dying. And Dr. Port wrote a beautiful poem, and in it, he wants you to envision Beausoleil's last night. The poem is entitled Beausoleil's Last Night. Now, this man had been fighting the British, he had been in prison, he brought his people to the promised land, and he gets there, and he gets sick, and he dies. He doesn't even know where he is. There's no name. And so Burke, in this very moving poem, talks about his last night in darkness, a dreamless sleep that will never end on the Bayou Teche. So the first year we raised about $50,000, and we bought the sensing device that you see here to detect underground disturbances. And we started getting permission to dig in certain locations. You can't just go dig in a graveyard. You have to get a permit from the state. And that took us about a year to get it. But we continued on a very positive public relations campaign. We went to every festival. The man, the tall man in the middle with the sunglasses, well, the tall man in the middle, that's Al Broussard, who was the mayor of Loreauville. And he took charge. He was raising money from all sources. He was beating the bushes. He'd come with the students from UL, introduced them to the neighbors to see if they had stories. And tragically, he got killed in a car crash 2015. So in his memory, they created a 5K run. And all the money from that was donated to the New Acadia Project for several years. And so Mark did a lot of stories in the newspaper. It touched a nerve because almost everybody in Acadiana can trace linkage to that first big group. This map comes from Carl Brusser's book, The Founding of New Acadia, and it shows where the first settlements were on St. Gabriel, but then that dissipated. There wasn't enough Acadians to stay there. The smallest settlements, Courtelet, Beaubridge, Broussard, Loreauville, False Point, and then ultimately they started spreading out more toward Vermilionville. Now this is a critical map because it shows where the Spanish government later gave Spanish land grants to those Acadians who had settled on those lands for at least 10 years. And so we do know that most of the Broussards were on the, as you're looking to your northwest corner or upper left, I know you can't read the names, but those are the descendants of Beausoleil. But these are the ones, they settle around that, they call it False Point, and we believe Loreauville is situated right in that loop, and we think that would have been their first settlement based on the findings. Remote sensing at a place called Trinity Oak, where we found a lot of artifacts. You see, somebody had erected a little statue of the Virgin Mary in the backyard to protect it, believing it was a cemetery. There is an old Broussard family cemetery. It's not accessible. You need hip boots to get there. Here you see some photographs. You do have some above ground tombs. It's really mystical to go there. Some of these places are so beautiful. After rains, the students were asked to walk. It's called a pedestrian survey. They're all equidistant apart, walking in a straight line to try to see and find artifacts in the sugarcane field. These would be some of the artifacts. A little known fact about Acadian culture and Acadian economy. Before the deportation, the Acadians' economic situation was as good as any people in Europe. Now, I'm not talking about the aristocracy, I'm talking about the average person. They had accumulated wealth through their hard work for 150 years. So they had money. Now, they lost most of it in the deportation. But nevertheless, when they got to Louisiana, they exchanged whatever money, it was called card money. They didn't have paper, but they had playing cards. So the government, before they left, took their money and gave them a card and wrote us an IOU. And they said, when y'all get to New Orleans, they're going to exchange it for their piastre. It was like going to a bank. So that's the only documentation, because they exchanged card money, different families. That's the only documentation we have as who was on that first boat. That's it. There's 40 family chiefs. They call themselves les chefs de famille. Again, picking it up from the Micmac, family chief. There were 38 men and 2 women, head of families. That document was found by one of our museum workers, René Papineau, from Richelieu, New Brunswick. He spent a summer in France, in the French archives, and he found that document. And Stephen White had never been able to find it. Stephen White is a noted, world-renowned genealogist. And he was so excited when we sent it to him, and he found 3 corrections on some of the names. And we have that on display at the Acadian Museum in Erath, and we make it available to anybody who wants to see it. You can go on our website, acadianmuseum.com. But that Acadian card money was really critical. Now, in 1768, the first revolution in North America took place in New Orleans, participated in by the Acadians. Not those who had come to Attakapo, those who had come later from Maryland primarily. And the revolution was against the Spanish governor, Yola. And part of that revolution was based on the fact that Yola wouldn't give them their card money. He said, I didn't agree to that. Forget about it. And they were infuriated. And along with some of the leaders in New Orleans that didn't like the Spanish, they made his ship leave. He hadn't gotten off his ship. He was still in the harbor. And they cut the ropes. They had guns and weapons and torches, and they made him leave. No shots were fired. But he left and went back to Cuba. And that's when the King of Spain sent Alexander O'Reilly, who was called Bloody O'Reilly, and he eventually tried. The trial took 1 hour, and he found 12 of them guilty, and that afternoon he hung 8 of them. These were not Acadians hung. He hung the leaders of the French that led the revolution. That's the first revolution against a European power, and the Acadians were right in the bunch with them. Such fascinating stories coming out of our heritage. Again, Dr. Reese, he's having to detail all of these artifacts, where it was found, when, what. He tells me The New Acadia project is the largest archaeology ongoing event in southern United States right now. So they're watching us. And our friends in Canada are watching us too. We get a lot of requests from some of their archaeologists. Now this is another old graveyard, again abandoned, the Bayou family cemetery near Loreauville. So that's how the students would plot out. And we ultimately, Dr. Reese decided it was time to do a dig in the cemetery, and we got permission of the state, and we actually did an excavation in that cemetery, and we thought we had the perfect diameter and length for a body in a box. It so appeared, with nails, and we dug, and guess what it was? It was a piece of iron from a sugar factory, and somehow got buried there. So much disappointment, but the search goes on. This was our second steering committee meeting in New Iberia. These are some of the students. A lot of these are volunteers. Some of the leaders are paid salaries to work on this. Some of these are in their master's program. I see Kim here. We see it in the back, Mr. Corwin, who's now deceased, but his widow Kim's here. Thanks for coming, Kim. She's our treasurer for New Acadia Project, and Corwin and Kim have been active from the very beginning. They never missed a meeting, I don't think. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with a few of the most recent photographs. This is Alan Broussard. Alan stepped down as president, and I've taken over effective January. And this is the English historical marker. We say New Acadia, because that's what they called it. And we know that because the priest Jean-Francois, a Capuchin priest that come with them, when they were hit with the epidemic to perform burials. He had come from Pointe-Coupée Parish. And in his notes are invaluable in many ways. That's the only records we have of what was happening there. He was telling us who he was burying and where he was burying them. The problem was they had not yet been able to establish permanent camps. It was temporary. They called them camps. Camp Beausoleil, Camp Ompoupo, Camp Broussard. And so the priest could only note in his records what they were telling him. They were being buried. So that's why we have such a mystery of where the bodies were buried. So that's what this marker is, right outside. That's the bridge in Loreauville. And very close to that, if any of you know Loreauville, there's a large Indian mound. And so you would expect if the Acadians had to quickly decide where to bury people, they would have probably looked to an Indian burial ground, feeling it was probably a high place and a good place. So that's what we suspect. Now, right next to Allen is an old fire station, and the town of Loreauville has already agreed they're going to make an Acadian museum, documenting what I'm telling you in their museum in Loreauville. They don't have any historical feature to their community now, so hopefully that will put them on the map. Now this is the reverse side of the sign, which we have it in French, the same marker, Nouvelle Acadie, as the priest referred to them, being in Nouvelle. They said, nous sommes à Nouvelle Acadie. Okay, so the next one is what's called an Acadian Odyssey Monument. It has not been unveiled. It will be unveiled in April. And it cost about $40,000. It's made from stone cut. And this is the 18th Acadian Odyssey Monument in the world. In 1999, a group was formed. I was on the committee to try to develop sites like this all over the world, anywhere there was an Acadian presence. There is one in Houma, and this would be the second in Louisiana. So as you walk around it, it tells you the Acadian story in French and English, but then there's one part that particularizes why it's located on this particular site, and it's because it was the first Acadian settlement. So help me with the date. I think the date's April 27th, Gail?
That's the proposed date, but it's not been verified.
Okay.
April 27th.
Because the committee has to come down from Canada. I think that date, that's the same time as Festivals Internationale, I think.
Yeah.
So it would be a good time to have it when you get a lot of the Canadians and French people down. So everybody would be available to come and view this. It's going to be an exciting day. Now, this pretty much concludes my presentation, and many of these come from Shane's book, Cajuns, and this book is used in the schools to teach the kids in French immersion their Acadian history. Let's see, today, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be on a Zoom call with the tourism directors of the 22 parishes in Acadia. Berthelot is in charge of the Lafayette Tourism Office, and he has put together this Zoom call. We will have some Acadians that are from Canada on the call, from Grand Pré National Park. We're going to have people from the Louisiana Department of Tourism, and we're going to have members of the New Acadia Project. We're going to try to give this same PowerPoint that I'm giving to you right now to the tourism directors of every parish in Acadia. The goal is to, number one, get them to understand how the New Acadia Project doesn't just benefit Loreauville, it benefits Acadia. And we've got to work together. We have a golfing trail, a bird trail, a Creole trail, a music trail, and a food trail. We don't have an Acadian or Cajun trail. How cool would it be? Tourists come to Erath all the time. They don't know what to do. Where do we go next? Well, you go to Avery Island, or you go to Lafayette. So we should have an inner trail that you can do in one day, and then have an outer trail where you do all of Acadia. So we're going to try to implore and convince these directors they need to buy into our project. And they need to sign on to it, help us raise some more money to finish the job. And the ultimate goal is to be named as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Now that's a big deal. There's one in Louisiana, Poverty Point, in the extreme northeast that hardly anybody goes. I've been there, it's very moving, but it's kind of like a disappointment. You know, you just see a few mounds, a big mound, and you see the story as the largest Native American, oldest in the country. But we would have so much to offer because Grand Pré got that designation as a World Heritage Site in 2012. The man in charge was Mr. Claude de Grasse. He is going to be on that Zoom call with us. And so we're going to let him tell how important that is to Grand Pré today. Because you're part of an international marketing. And so my goal or our dream would be to link us with Grand Pré. Because we're an extension of Grand Pré. We were born in France, but our Acadian culture developed in Canada, but it's still developing here. We're all of the same story. So how cool would it be for tourists to go to Grand Pré, come to Acadia, and see and compare the differences? So we have a lot going. We have a lot of planning to do. A lot of the family reunions are starting to reorganize again. We just had one Friday night. The Broussards have reorganized. I know the Bros are very active, and Héberts are too. So there's a lot going, and we're going to try to keep this momentum going. You can visit our website, acadianmuseum.com. If you don't get our newsletter, La Parole, which goes out to about 5,000 people and organizations, give me your email, or you can email me at the website. It will come to me. and you'll get a monthly newsletter which keeps you advised on a lot of these happenings. So I'm right at 1 hour, William, and I'll be more than happy to take any questions from anybody. My wife's book, which she just released, I have just 2 left. I sold one to Miss Trump there, on healing traditions of South Louisiana. She's actually sold out. She only has a few left. They're going to do a second printing. And Mary is a traiteur, thanks to Monsieur Alain Simon from Meaux. You call yourself from Meaux or?
Mohican.
Mohican. So Alan is the star of Mary's book. So do y'all have any questions, or would y'all like to make any comments about anything? Y'all can join, y'all can donate. We're a 501c3. We charge nothing. All the money goes directly to UL. Yes, Alan?
The first, I'm short of breath. The first industry that we had in South Louisiana was not what some people might think. It was the cattle industry. And it was not the Cajun who started, it was Harrington from England that had an operation in Port Arthur, Texas, where the Rodair Club was. And he'd buy cattle from the area, and he'd come across South Louisiana. Highway 14 was the original cattle trail in America. Not what you see on TV, Whoopee-Kaye and the old Chisholm Trail and all that. And incidentally, Whoopee-Kaye is a mispronunciation. Who grew up on a farm can tell me the most common name for a cow? Cayette. It was Whoopee-Kaye. Get on. Because these cows were driven from Texas all the way to Vacherie, Louisiana. And there's one of my cousins, Dr. Al Simon, who was a professor in Lafayette. That's where he was from. And they'd bring the cattle there, and they had pens and barges to feed the Yankees and whoever was in need of meat. You didn't go to Winn-Dixie back then. But I enjoyed your presentation, and I'm a descendant of what was Joseph's brother.
Alexandre.
Alexandrie?
Alexandre.
Yeah, and that was my inheritance. That's the way I came. So I can't say I'm from Joseph, but I'm from his brother.
Well,
Not bad.
I'll tell you what Stephen White told us in a talk. Beausoleil was the brawn. He was the fighter. He was thrown in jail 4 times for fighting and beating up people. And Alexandre was the brain. But together they were formidable. They were tough together, tough crew. Now, you know, I'm putting together a paper to submit to this World Heritage Site. They only allow applications every 10 years. That's how hard it is to get. But you've got to go through steps. NAP is step number 1. Unification, historical nature, and uniqueness. Now, I'm trying to always create what makes Acadiana so unique to put in that paper. I worked on it all weekend, coming up with different ideas. I'll throw a few at you right now. Did y'all know Acadiana is the most culturally diverse region in the United States of America? Census proves it. More people claim a different ethnicity than American lives in Acadiana. Number 1. Kunas. Thank God there were some couillons working for Dresser in 1970, and they would call Calvin Roach from Crowley a Kunas, and he was a nuclear engineer, and he was working on the big 3 Mile Island. Dresser had built that nuclear plant that had a meltdown, and Dresser was in trouble for mistakes. And Calvin Roach would point out the mistakes, and they didn't want to hear. They called it, we don't want to hear from a dumb Kunas from Louisiana. He had heard of the Civil Rights Act, granting rights to workers in the workplace from being free of harassment due to an ethnicity as a minority in America. That's what the Civil Rights Act did. It wasn't just for blacks, it was for minorities. But you had to prove you were from another country to have protection. Calvin Roach went to see Jimmy DiMaggio and said, I want to sue Dresser, they're going to fire me. I know I'm doomed. They filed a lawsuit against Dresser in Lake Charles, and the judge, Edwin Hunter, ruled in favor of Calvin Roach in 1980. It's a famous, famous case. It's cited in the United States government as to what is a minority in America. They cite that case for what the judge wrote. And I know he had the best historian write that opinion. What the judge had to do is decide, is Calvin Roach a Cajun, a descendant from an Acadian, a minority? And to do that, you had to prove you came from a different country. The problem was, Acadia was never a country, and Canada wasn't formed until 100 years later. There was no Canada until the Civil War. So, the judge, wise judge, recited Acadian history, just like I told you. And he says, I rule today. There's 10 characteristics that make you part of a nation. And you don't have to come from a sovereign state. You can come from a nation if you have similar language, culture, history, or attitudes of life, religion. And he checked them all off. And he says, I rule Calvin Roach as a minority. So you today, if you're a descendant from an Acadian, have protection under the Civil Rights Act as any other Asian, Jewish, or Black American. Now, why is that important? Because, as I mentioned earlier, they couldn't go back to France and become Frenchmen or French women. They were a different people. They were Acadians. And that's what the judge ruled. He says, I rule they are a different ethnicity than Americans. So don't you think UNESCO is going to have to take a hard look at us? And we got to save this place. And one of the arguments we're going to make, and this was a good one, I never thought of it until Claude de Glace told me this last week. He said, y'all have the first place where they moved a tribe of Indians from their native lands at Point à la Hache because they lost their lands. So you need to put that in your, because if you're a World Heritage Site, there's money to save the sites. So as we are threatened from coastal erosion, hopefully that'll make us more an interesting place to visit, being threatened as we are by coastal erosion. So there's a lot of different things. I mean, look, our food. I mean, we're like a different category of food in the world today, thanks to people like Paul Prudhomme and all the great chefs. So we just have a terribly interesting culture, and I think, and by the way, to be a World Heritage Site, it doesn't just have to be a structure like the pyramids or Point. It can be a culture. It can be a culture. So that's our long-term plans. Any other questions or comments?
Warren, I just want to say that your wife Mary, Perrin, and Miss Beverly Fuselier will be in Rain this coming Thursday, and they're going to have their presentation of healing traditions of Acadiana. And so y'all all welcome to come. And it's going to be in the green room in Rain at right behind the Civic Center in Rain. We normally have our French table in the old Bernard Bertrand home right across from the police station, but to accommodate more people, we go to the green room, and City of Rain provides that to us. And that's all I wanted to say. You're all welcome, and thank you very much, Warren.
I'll mention one last thing because I think it's interesting. I mentioned the Acadians, by not taking the unconditional oath, they refused the unconditional oath, and that was like a de facto revolt against the British, and it just infuriated them. I mentioned the revolution of 1768 in New Orleans where they kicked Yola out. That was an armed revolution. No one died. A bloodless coup. But New Orleans was unruled for 12 months. And it was like a wild place for a year until O'Reilly came back. So the Acadians were involved in those two revolutions. And guess what? Galvez called upon the Acadians to join his militia, the Spanish militia, to go fight the British. And boy, did they respond. And many of you who are in the Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution know that a lot of our ancestors fought, including Armand Broussard, Beausoleil's youngest son. They defeated the British in 3 battles in Louisiana, including Baton Rouge and Manchac. But then, most of the men had to go home to take care of their crops. And so they walked back home or rode their horses back. Galvez was so impressed with Armand's performance, he implored him to stay with the Spanish army, which he did, and got on the Spanish Armada, and they lay siege at the British forts at Mobile and Pensacola. When the big forts fell, that meant the war was essentially over. Because the Mississippi was controlled by the French because they had won New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Canada had fought the British from the north, and now the South and the Gulf had fallen to the Spanish, and the French had now blockaded the East Coast. That's when Cornwallis surrendered 3 months after those forts fell. And Armand Broussard was at that battle the whole time. How do I know that? Pick up the book Independence Lost by Dr. Duval. She's a historian, PhD, University of South Carolina. She wrote that book about 8 people that helped to win the American Revolution that nobody ever heard of. And there's a whole chapter on Armand Broussard. So we were involved in 3 revolutions in North America. Doesn't that make us unique? Not to mention what we did in the other wars. Kermit.
You persuaded the Queen to apologize. You mentioned today that most of the bad stuff came from Massachusetts, mainly the Boston area. So what did, I read it, but I don't remember it. What did the Queen basically say?
My favorite subject, besides talking about my family, I mentioned the Acadians who remained in Nova Scotia after that 1-year period were British subjects from 1714 until the deportation. And as a British subject, you could not be deported except by an act of Parliament. That's in the Petition of Right of 1621. I didn't know that existed. I started this whole effort in 1988 to get an apology when America apologized to the Japanese Americans for their deportations in World War II after Pearl Harbor. We deported 120,000 Asian families, and they lost everything. But they petitioned for an apology and for money, and they got it. Our government gave them $1.8 billion in 1988, and Ronald Reagan gave them an apology. Every living Japanese American got $20,000. And one of my close friends, Walter Amahara, who I have his picture in a book on the back, he was a weightlifter at SLI. He was the first weightlifter to win a national championship for SLI in their history. And that book, I was on the team after him, tells that story. We won 8 national championships. That's another story. But when I got the idea, the Japanese got an apology, well, why don't I get an apology from the Queen? So that took 2 years of research. And ultimately, I filed the lawsuit in 1990. And that was the critical point. It was never ordered by Parliament or the King or the Secretary of State or anybody. It was a local illegal militia act against British law. So I never blamed the Queen. I just said, you're the head of the government and you're the head of the crown. And it was done in your name. When John Winslow read the proclamation of deportation, he starts out, in the name of the King of England and the crown, you are forfeited all of your assets except what you can carry, and your lands are lost forever. So it was, legally it was easy. But I had a lot of obstacles to overcome. Just like Nat, it took me 5 years to get public support. And the Congrès Mondial Acadien helped, because I was invited there as a speaker in '94. They didn't know who was a Cajun from Louisiana. And it had to come from a Cajun, because we're the revolutionaries, right? In Canada, they couldn't do that. You couldn't sue the Queen. Nobody's ever sued the Queen but me. And I know that because her biography called me before she died and interviewed me. And this was early last year, and she was updating the Queen's biography, and she said, "What did you think about the Queen?" She wanted me to say something controversial. And I said 3 or 4 times, "She's the wisest woman who ever lived. She did the right thing. I just set it up for her." Because when you read the Royal Proclamation, it says, for the first time, we acknowledge the deportation was done in the name of the Crown. They had never acknowledged it. They could always say it was those couillons from Boston. You see, if some of y'all remember Iran Contra and Colonel Oliver North, remember that? It's a parallel event in history. Because what Oliver North did was against United States law. You couldn't trade arms with the Contras in Nicaragua. They concocted this big scheme to go around Congress to do the exact same they weren't supposed to do. And North was in charge of it. And he testified before Congress and admitted to it. And was convicted later, but it was overturned because he had testified in Congress. Nevertheless, it was an illegal act by John Winslow and his militia. Lawrence was there, though. Lawrence was supervising everything. And he represented the Queen, the Crown. He was the lieutenant governor. So there was that connection. I'll tell you who saved us was Dudley LeBlanc. Because I knew everything in the law, you have a deadline when you have to file a suit or a charge. There's one exception, murder. Murder never expires. You can always be charged for murder. That's why you see some people charged 50 years after when they find DNA. But here I was dealing with an event that took place 250 years ago. And I was afraid we'd be thrown out of court for having waited too long. But Dudley LeBlanc's book, Acadian Miracle, written in 1962, I think, he had some appendix in the back. And he had found a petition filed by Acadians in 1760, those who were in concentration camps in Philadelphia. And they wrote a beautiful petition, and 4 of them went to London and wanted to deliver it to the king. They wanted the king to see they had been mistreated. But they thought the king didn't know what had taken place. Of course he knew, but they were trying to make it right. And he wouldn't even see them. He never received them. And that's in this petition, and it's explained what happened. So my lawsuit took their petition. I took up their case. I asked for the same things they asked for. Exactly. And so my petition was really taking theirs up, which I said was still alive, because the king never denied it, he never accepted it. That was my defense there. When I started this in 1990, the British Crown had never apologized to anything in its history of 1,200 years. Never. So most people thought I was smoking dope when I did it. Why would I do that? Well, I figured, let me try. Nothing. In 1995, the Queen went to New Zealand and she issued the first apology to the Maori native people. The British destroyed the whole island and killed almost every one of them. They did that to many islands. During that time, they believed if you couldn't convert you to Christianity, you were better being killed. That was the thinking of these natives. And they did that to many of those people in the ocean islands. But I knew I had a chance when that happened. But, timing is everything. The 1990s, when I was going after this, was the longest period of no wars going on. Major war, nothing. It was a decade of peace. 1989, the Berlin Wall went down. The Cold War was over. 91, the Soviet Union collapses. So all of these countries were being liberated. So that's the time period I was lucky to fall into that. And so countries were not afraid to look introspectively. As of today, the Crown has apologized 6 times. So we're the 6th apology. And you still see more and more coming around. When I was being interviewed by the Queen's biographer, Mary was listening on the phone, on the speaker. And when it was over with, she said, "Did you ever thank the Queen?" I said, "No, I didn't." Well, she said, "I think you should. She's getting pretty old. You know, it might be a good time to do it." I said, "Okay." So I wrote a letter, and I contacted Monsieur Etienne, who's the French ambassador in Washington. He's come to Lafayette twice. That's how I knew him. And he came with President Macron in New Orleans just last month. So il aime des gratons. Boy, ils sont boulés avec des gratons. So we bought him some gratons when he came to New Orleans. Anyway, he helped me get a man in Buckingham Palace that would guarantee if I sent that email to him, it would get to the Queen. I knew if I just mailed it, it would never get there. So I did it, I emailed it, and about 2 months later, I got a response. And it happened to be 8 days before the Queen died. And so we took the letter and the envelope, and we had it framed, and we have it on display, where you can see at the museum the apology. By the way, we don't have the original. The original is in the archives of Canada at Ottawa, but we have the only signed copy, facsimile. Now, you're not going to see the Queen's signature. She doesn't sign anything. It's signed by the Governor General, Adrian Clarkson. And it was a wonderful 15-year experience. Traveled all over the world. I'll tell you a personal thing that developed. I found my son-in-law for my daughter to marry at a conference in France. In Normandy Beach is a big museum where all the soldiers are buried at Normandy Beach in Caen, called the Mémorial de la Paix, Memorial to Peace. Beautiful museum. And every year they invite 10 lawyers to come do a talk. And I was invited to talk about my suit against the Queen. They considered it an important human rights cause. And there was a young Quebec lawyer there named Jean Wallet, and he was representing an Inuit tribe that the government was trying to displace to build a dam. Everybody had to have a real case. You couldn't just make it up. And so the winner got $10,000, and Jean won as the best speaker. And of course, everybody had to do it in French. And so after, we have a big party, we're all drinking wine, and I stood up. Of course, as we Cajuns do, I invited, "Viens nous voir à la Louisiana." So Jean jumped up. He dit, "Je vais aller, j'ai vu une photo de ta fille." Love at first sight. They got married 2 years later. And I thought they'd go to Canada to live, where he was practicing in Quebec, but he was very lucky he married a Cajun girl, because Quebec and Louisiana are the only 2 places in North America that still have the old Napoleonic Civil Code, which is another unique thing about us. So, World Heritage Site, and one more thing, we're the only state that still has the Civil Code of Napoleon. And so Jean was able to take and pass the bar, and he managed my law firm for 30 years.
Wow.
And they have 2 kids. I call them Quebec Cajuns. And they speak better French than me, so I'm very proud of them for that. So it was a great experience, and thanks for asking that question. That has been a great experience. Any other questions?
Can I ask you one question?
Sure.
The flag that we have, the Acadian flag, we're the only Cajuns that have this flag.
In the world.
In the bottom is the castle of Spain. Why do we have the castle of Spain there?
Because when we came here, France had given the colony to Spain. So we were really Spanish citizens, and Spain provided all of the supplies for us to get started and gave us Spanish land grants. So if you go into the oldest records of every courthouse, the first records there are going to be from the King of Spain, giving title to lands in South Louisiana. Spanish. And that's why New Iberia You see, Galvez was from Malaga, Spain. Kermit Puyo and I went to Malaga, Spain, which was the hometown of all of the people recruited to settle in New Iberia. 18 families came in 1768. Galvez handpicked them because it was a plum to be able to come start a new life in the New World. And so he handpicked his families. And Kermit and I spent 2 days there. And they made sure we went to see the Cathedral of Malaga. Some of you who like to Google one-arm Cathedral of Malaga, because most cathedrals have 2 bell towers. Malaga has 1. They brought Kermit and I into the cathedral. Malaga is a large town of about 1 million people on the Mediterranean. It's a beautiful tourist town. And you walk in and there's a big plaque in 3 languages telling you the story. The Spanish who settled in New Iberia settled a Spanish lake where it was too low the first year, and they were flooded out. So they were wiped out. And they wrote back to their relatives in Malaga and said, please send us food, money for food. We lost everything. And the people voted to use all the money they had been saving to finish the cathedral. They sent it to Louisiana, and they never finished the cathedral. And that story is told in the church, in the cathedral. And they moved to where New Iberia is situated today.
What year was that?
Something different, huh? We're different.
What year was that?
They settled 10 years after the Acadians. Acadians got here in 65. So they got in New Iberia about early 70s, 1770s. And of course, quickly intermarried. Here's another thing that makes us unique. There were 500,000 French came to Louisiana right before the Civil War. That was the richest place in America. King was cotton, the plantations. They built the garden district. Money was there. So all of these poor Frenchmen, skilled craftsmen, carpenters, they came to work on these plantations. 500,000 came from 1830 to 1860. You know how many Acadians came? A little over 3,000. So compare that. But we're the only ones that came here to transplant the culture, not to become Americanized, which is why we have French immersion and why we're talking about this today. So it's a different way of honoring our ancestors who fought so hard to keep their heritage alive, risk everything to do it. Every other French group became Americanized immediately. Those that came from Haiti, those that came from the French Revolution, those that settled in St. Martinville, those that settled in Avalos Parish, who came from the British territories of Alabama. So we're the ones that kept it different. And when we intermarried with the Spanish, the Spanish would talk French, not Spanish, right? You don't hear much. Now you hear more Spanish in New Iberia than French because of the immigrants, but that's another story. We should, because of how Spain treated us, Ms. Tromo, we should be respectful for refugees and hopefully they treated us magnificently. And we had a chance to thank King Juan Carlos of Spain. He came to Jackson, Mississippi, and he opened a big art exhibit. And a bunch of us, Len Bro and several others, A.J. LeBlanc, we brought a big Acadian flag and we gave it to King Juan Carlos. He didn't know the story. We told him we're honoring Spain's support of our people. And we gave him the flag. Any other questions? So I'll be in the back if anybody wants to look at some of our books. I did the first book on the biography of Beausoleil Broussard. We don't know what he looks like. We made him look like kind of a Mi'kmaq Indian because supposedly his great-grandmother was a Mi'kmaq. And I don't know if we have genealogists here or not, but we don't know whether Beausoleil's father was born in Acadia, France. It's a mystery. Some people have written that his name was Jean Broussard, Jean-Francois, but Stephen White doesn't agree. He says his name was just Francois, and there's no proof. We're not sure if he was born here or came from France, so we have no connection to France, linkage, and proof. Some people have written that it was a Jean-Francois Broussard who came over on the ship Loreauville, but Stephen White says no. So that's why when I wrote this book 20 years ago, I put that in there, and no one's ever disputed it. And then in 2016, we did a book called Acadia Then and Now, which is a little encyclopedia. It's 550 pages. By the way, we do all our books in French and English. We sell many more French books than English, especially at our national museums. That's where the tourists come and they want to buy a French book. So, Acadia Then and Now is a little different. It's not a story, it's 40 stories. We found 40 places in the world where hopefully you're going to have an Acadian Odyssey monument like we're going to have here in Loreauville. There's 18 now, but we could have 40, ultimately. 4 in France, probably 25 in Canada, Michigan, Boston, Massachusetts. They got Acadian communities all over Boston. Texas, probably more Acadians in Texas than Louisiana, to be honest with you. My trick question when I do a talk on Beausoleil is, where are you going to find more Broussards? And people say, Abbeville, huh? No, Houston. Check the phone book in Houston. Quantity-wise, there's more. So they do festivals, Acadian festivals all over East Texas. So that book is a history book, and it was voted the best book published in the world on Acadian history that year. And Mary and I went to France to get the award in Paris, and that was the night before that horrible, massive shooting in a nightclub in Paris. They killed like 80 people. It was horrible. Paris was like shut down. It was not a fun time to be in Paris. Anyway, so those are some of the books. And then we did some little picture books that you see all over in grocery stores. We did the history of Vermilion Parish, St. Landry Parish, and Iberia Parish. And Kermit and I went to Malaga. We went to the library and we did a talk on Iberia Parish story in the library and gave them one of our books. No more questions? Yes, sir.
I just want to make a short statement. I'm friends with Mark Sawa in Eunice, the musician, and I've heard him say many times, it's just this line he says, why would you want to trade a bowl of gumbo or a lake of boudin for American hot dog? I think that kind of tops off what you're saying.
I have figured out how to give a 5-minute talk or a 5-hour talk. And one of the things Carl Brasser helped me with, to give a 5-minute talk on our history, is to go and start with like 1916, stop speaking French. And you go 1940, the war was the critical point where my dad was used as an interpreter, and they felt for the first time the value of the French language as an interpreter in the war. And Dad wasn't in Europe, where most of them were. He was in the South Pacific, used as an interpreter in the army. And he always told me, he disait, j'ai parti un Cajun, mais j'ai revenu un Américain. And that goes to what I was telling y'all. They didn't want to be Americanized until after the war. They had no dog in that fight with the Civil War or World War I. It just wasn't part of their life. And so that was a big change. And so that created that movement. And then Dewey Balfour goes and performs on stage at the Jazz Festival in Newport. And he came home, spent the rest of his life promoting the music. And that was important because the language had been kept in the music. And then, I'll go quicker, but in '74, Codeville had the first festival, tribute to Cajun music. And it was 12,000 people in a pouring rainstorm, but they told the whole story of the music. And that kept the momentum going. And then the Civil Rights Act was passed, and that made Codeville create itself. Ça disait, mais pourquoi pas nous autres? Pas juste les Noirs. So Ultimately, Judge Babineau got the Constitution of Louisiana changed in '74. We have the most protective laws in our Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause. We have our constitutional right to our linguistic heritage. They can never prevent us from speaking French. It's in the Constitution. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, my dad's 91, and I'm starting to ask him for stories. And there's just two real quick ones. He said, well, when he was in school in Maurice, and he said they told us not to speak French, but we did it anyway. And then during the war, he was probably about 10 or 9, I guess. He said, I was a plane spotter. They'd have the kids go out and look for German planes in Maurice. I know, I was like, oh, that's a good story.
Well, this is true.
Yes, true.
There were men from Vermilion Parish and Cameron Parish who joined the armed forces, and because of their unique situation, knowing the marshlands, speaking French, trappers, hunters, they never left home. They rode horseback along the beach looking for submarines, because there were some submarines that they found at the mouth of the Mississippi. And Bernie David, who died, his father, and it's in our book on Vermilion Parish, we have him on his horse looking for submarines. Now we look for balloons. They say, we just did a symposium. We have a section of lawyers. We have 110 lawyers who speak French out of 6,000 in the state. And I'm president of our own Francophone section. And we have our own thing. Instead of going to seminars in Baton Rouge, we go to Paris. We go to Quebec. And so we have a lot of members that come with us. But we just put a symposium on at Tulane University. And this is in our newsletter, La Parole. If those of you get, I'll put pictures of the next La Parole. Give me your email and I'll send you a copy. We spent a whole day talking about our civil code. I mean, how wonderful it is. And it was a progressive law. Women have equal rights under community property, where other women never had that for many decades. But Napoleon was a revolutionary. He had kicked the king out. So he was fighting for the people. And when he died, a professor was making a talk about this. You know, Napoleon was known as one of the greatest military leaders. He said, the world will never remember the 80 battles I have won, and I conquered the world. The only thing they're going to remember about me is the Napoleonic Civil Code. And he's right. 2/3 of the world today now have the Civil Code. Countries come from professors come from all over to Louisiana to study our civil code. It's so simple. It's basic, it's outlined, and China has it, Vietnam has it. Countries you would never suspect have it. Now they can change it, but it's basically the right of men, how you possess things, and how you can sell and acquire things. It doesn't do with criminal law. It deals with person-to-person law. And it's very, very basic, and it goes back to the Roman laws, but that's something that really makes us very unique. It's good for lawyers too, because other lawyers can't come practice here. We throw out these French laws and codes. I'm going to have to hire a Louisiana lawyer to study that problem. So we have to go to law school an extra half a year in Louisiana when other states don't, because we study both the common law and civil. I don't want to I'm getting too legal for y'all right now, but I think that's interesting.
Good program.
Anything else? Okay, William, I earned my fee.
Yep.
Very good.